Translated with DeepL.com. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial translation. The sneakiness of the EU Dictatorship Framework Treaty.
It is worth mentioning that terror is also perpetrated against Switzerland, namely by the EU dictatorship with the so-called Framework Treaty, which is so insidiously structured that Switzerland loses its complete independence if it is signed and ratified as a result of ignorance, unreasonableness and stupidity by unneeded or EU dictatorship adherents. If a binding signing of the treaty were to take place, this would be the end of Swiss legal certainty, because it would be suspended as quickly as possible by the EU dictatorship. The underhand nature of this treaty is aimed at driving Switzerland without rights into this dictatorship and thus the Swiss population into Union citizenship. This would also invalidate the mutual negotiations, which are referred to as bilateral negotiations, but which have all served and continue to serve from the outset solely to subject Switzerland and its people to the EU dictatorship. If this were to happen, Switzerland and its people would be hopelessly under the EU dictatorship spat and would be severely punished if any EU dictatorship regulations etc. were not observed. This fact, however, has not been recognized since the beginning of the first bilateral negotiations by that part of the relevant government officials, nor by many to this day, whose minds and reasoning have been and still are too illiterate to recognize the reality and truth hidden in all treaties with the EU dictatorship. With the forthcoming framework agreement, which will now be renamed, if Switzerland were to sign and ratify it as a result of ignorance, unreasonableness and thus the stupidity of the Swiss government, Switzerland and the entire people would automatically become EU dictatorship vassals and would inevitably become subject to EU dictatorship law and thus also to EU dictatorship jurisdiction. Another inevitable consequence would be that the constitution and semi-democracy and neutrality, as well as the independence and cantonal alliance of Switzerland would be declared void, abolished and banned, as would autonomy, self-determination and, ultimately, statehood, and the fact that Switzerland and its people, as EU dictatorship vassals, would have to pay many billions more to the dictatorship every year is also already clear, as is the fact that Switzerland and its people no longer have any right to decide either themselves or through elections, or with regard to independent judicial measures of any kind against undesirable migrants, criminals and criminals, whereby the EU dictatorial death penalty decided in Lisbon would inevitably also affect Switzerland as well as the Swiss people. By concluding the framework agreement that could not be more insidious, Switzerland would also lose all its national competences and all conceivable municipal and state instruments, which would render Switzerland as incapable of domestic and foreign policy. These are the effective facts of the future to be expected for Switzerland and the Swiss population if the underhand framework agreement of the EU dictatorship were signed and ratified. However, this should be prevented, contrary to all EU dictatorship supporters, which can only happen if Switzerland, or rather its politicians and all the sincere and righteous of the Swiss government, as well as the majority of the Swiss people, who are devoted to the equally honorable and worthy of the politicians and rulers, ensure that this dictatorial framework treaty is not signed and not ratified. It is also necessary for the Swiss people to raise their voices and speak de facto and determine what must be and what must not be, as is the duty of all righteous politicians, of the National Council and the Council of States, as well as of the highest authority, the Federal Council, contrary to those who are treacherously willing to sell Switzerland off to the EU dictatorship, as you sometimes express it.
What you say is all well and good, but unfortunately it is the case that most people, including the Swiss, whom you have addressed, do not dare to express their opinions freely in public. The majority of the people are afraid to say publicly what moves them effectively and corresponds to their opinion, which is why they do not make use of the freedom of opinion as it is recorded according to December 10, 1948 with the following resolution.
Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive and disseminate information and ideas by any means of communication, regardless of frontiers.
The majority of people are afraid of official, governmental and demographic insults, reprisals, legal proceedings and violence against themselves when they publicly expose themselves to their opinions. What I want to say anyway, even if some people feel offended by it and will speak disparagingly about me and my words, is actually an Achilles heel and thus a huge lack of self-confidence, personal inadequacy and cowardice, which on the one hand affects the well-being of society and ultimately also democracy in relation to Switzerland and its constitution, and the fact that the different political parties are pulling against each other and turning each other into sows instead of working together in a good way and creating valuable consensus with each other also affects democracy. And this is unfortunately the case because in practically all parties illogical and ill-considered ideologies and know-it-all prevail, which want to be realized and enforced by a personal striving for power and the will to exercise power of the respective originators of the ideas and the know-it-all with all force. Thus it is impossible for all those righteous politicians and rulers to be able to bring to bear every effectively well and properly thought-out fact for the benefit of the state, democracy and the people. And this is the case in every respect, including in relation to the state financial administration, which I will cite another time as an example. This is due to the fact that the Federal Finance Commissioner, Federal Councillor Raleigh Moore, whom I personally appreciate, which I also want to say openly, can, according to the annual financial statement, report several billion less expenses than planned, which could have been used to repay the state debt, but which was rejected. This only because the self-righteous and the stupid, precisely those who do not form their minds in the reason and therefore cannot use them either, and consequently were able to enforce their know-it-all in order to squander the billions saved stupidly for the unnecessary. Well, to hold a clear, good, logical, correct and necessary opinion in public, I think, should be the fundamental duty of every citizen, but this is frowned upon for fear, so exactly the right thing is not done, because the majority of the population has only one big mouth at home in their own flat, in their circle of friends or in the pub, so that the political parties have to more or less alone come up with their good or crazy ideas. The fact, however, that the majority of citizens have the courage to publicly state their personal views and opinions and to give suggestions for changes in political and state behavior is illusory for the majority. So nothing at all happens in this respect, and consequently the majority of the Swiss never publicly address governmental and purely political concerns, nor laws, prohibitions, ordinances, treaties, economics and migration. So the army as well as the overall development of all necessities in all conceivable relations, areas and inevitable things of logical, expedient and necessary progress also falls flat when it comes to publicly speaking up and standing up for it. The majority of the population is geared to always doing the wrong thing, such as not freely and openly and on their own initiative and responsibility in any way, such as through writings, the Internet, newspapers and magazines, television, periodicals, etc. just according to today's possibilities of all kinds, to carry their own view, idea, consideration and opinion into the public. But if someone who summons up the courage comes out of a need, or because someone rushes for it in the background, as with the child Greta Thunberg, to do something himself and even to demonstrate it publicly, then the majority of all stupid people, even those without initiative and courage, like a herd of sheep, bleat, roar, howl, howl, yell and scream, run after them and rises, with a big mind, to heroism. But once the hustle and bustle of demonstrating is over, no matter what and for what the demonstrators are demonstrating, what the demonstrators themselves usually don't understand anyway and what the organizers assume to be false preconditions, everything fizzles out again, and is always only the fist in the trouser pockets is made by the men and the fist under the apron by the women, if they still wear one at all. It must also be said that the ideas, opinions and conceptions etc. of the majority of the population are just as drastically apart as those of the parties, politicians and the government itself, with a concordance of opinions prevailing in the highest government office, which demands from the very beginning that all those in power agree, but if not then that the person concerned does not allow himself to be forced into concordance, as was the case with Christoph Blocher. As far as the parties and the rulers themselves are concerned, it should be noted that those of them who are of the opinion that they have eaten wisdom with shovel excavators are the most stupid, and therefore the ones who have least them and are the greatest and most progressive are the most stupid. In their stupidity, precisely in their ignorance of reason and reason, they believe that they are empowered to degrade their fellow politicians, fellow governments and party members to self-proclaimed enemies and to drive them out of their positions with every conceivable dirty means or to discipline them in such a way that they become lurkers and, contrary to their own opinion, say yes and amen to everything. Thus every reasonable and righteous person, no matter if politician, partisan or governmental, as well as citizen, is strangled from any legitimation and any right to express his or her own personal opinion and to present his or her own, not infrequently good ideas and valuable reflection results, as well as views and suggestions. This is because, as a result of the use of their intellect and their reason, they are dissenters and thinkers of the future who are unrestrainedly suppressed for this purpose and disqualified as do-gooders of the world. Imbeciles and idiots are driven to controversies by polarization, whereby social and societal differentiation takes place and thus also an intensification of differences of opinion, whereby the lobbied are driven into despair and are supposed to give up their position.
April 21, 2019. Wise and unwise people.
A wise man can be recognized by the fact that he first strives to recognize all things according to reality and truth, then to consider everything and only then to explain and do what is necessary through word and deed. But the unwise and stupid man can be recognized by the fact that he does not strive to recognize reality and truth, but lets himself be faithfully misled and deceived by evil words of lies, does everything wrong and thereby suffers damage and falls into need and misery.
Samjasa Silver Star Center, June 15, 2019, 11:30 p.m., Billy. Moral value.
All people and peoples must have a healthy and moral value and cultivate it in a manner worthy of them. Put it into practice daily and consciously do everything in righteousness to defend it venerably and preserve it in its true value.
Samjasa Silver Star Center, June 15, 2019, 23:50 hours, Billy.